Hello Telluride Mushroom Festival, my name is Jessica Langley and I'm going to show you how to make paper with mushrooms. When you're ready to begin, you're going to want to make sure that you have a work surface that's able to be messy. Please don't use your antique heirloom furniture for this because it's a very messy process, it's a very wet process. When you're ready to begin, you're going to want to gather all your tools. These include rags, a blender that you don't mind if it burns out on you. So don't use your $400 Vitamix. Go to a thrift store and find one for $5 because these may or may not burn out once the motor gets going. You'll need a mold and decal, which I'll explain in a minute. You'll need a rubber tub, which will contain all of the slurry. Obviously, you're gonna need mushrooms. I also recommend having cheesecloth on hand, a spray bottle, and maybe a rag or a sponge. And lastly, you'll need a non-porous surface like glass, or you can even wrap tin foil around a piece of cardboard. And that's going to be what you dry your paper out on. In Western style paper making, the hand mold and decal is simply two wooden frames of the same size. This one happens to fit neatly inside the other, and I bought this at a local craft supply store. But you can also make them yourself using scrap wood and window screen. These are both the same size, and the mold is the piece that has the screen around it, and this is a window screen that I wrapped tightly and stapled to the back of the frame. And the decal, when placed on top of the screen and pulled through the slurry, is what forms the edge of the paper. You can actually make your decal any shape that you want by using duct tape. So you can put duct tape, cut it out, and make a stencil into any other kind of shape, like a mushroom, for example. Now, your rags are going to be what you transfer the wet slurry onto, and you want to make sure that these are large enough to fit the mold, and also smooth enough to not have too much tooth to them. So you don't want to use things like terry cloth, but some nice dish rags are fine. And your rubber tub, you want to make sure can actually fit your hands and the mold and decal comfortably without too much tension there. Also, your non-porous surfaces, you want to make sure will actually fit your mold and decal neatly, and those can come in any size. Once you've gathered all your tools, you're going to want material to work with also. In traditional paper making, the pulp is made of a lignocellulosic material that is either chemically or manually drawn from the source. So mostly it's from wood, which is what traditional like newspaper, magazines, and even toilet paper is made from. It can also be derived from cotton, which is what most fine art papers are made out of. But obviously, we're here to talk about mushrooms. I've found that polypores work the best. So these include everything from turkey tail to red belt polypore. But there's many other types of mushrooms that work, or many other types of polypores that work. I've just found that polypores that are pliable when fresh work the best. Some can be too hard and some can be too soft. So most guild mushrooms are a little too soft to be working with paper making. And then some like chaga are way too hard and they'll just absolutely break your blender. Depending on the type of mushroom that you use, you can get different colors of paper. So obviously lighter color like turkey tail or Piptoporus betulinus, the birch polypore, will give you some lighter color paper. The red belt polypore, or Fomitopsis pinicola, which has a sort of more orangey color, will give you some sort of brown paper. And then other papers like, I think Styrium, or other mushrooms like Styrium hirsutum, have almost like a purplish hue to them when made into paper. So there's a wide range of mushrooms to use, and here's a list that I've found work wonderful for paper making. These mushrooms work really well because they have a high chitin content. And chitin is the biological polymer that makes up the cell walls of fungi, which is similar to cellulose, which is the key ingredient in plant-based paper. When you're out in the woods looking for mushrooms, you're going to find polypores of various sizes and densities. Obviously, turkey tail is small and pliable and works really wonderful. It also dries out really quickly, so you can save these for later use pretty easily. Red belt polypores, on the other hand, are very hard and very large. You can dry these out for later use, but when it comes time to actually make your paper, you're going to need to have small pieces that you put into your blender. You can cut the polypores up while they're fresh using a utility knife, or if you dry it out, like this one is pretty tough already, I would need to soak this for maybe overnight in order to make sure that that material is very pliable. Right now this is too hard and I would never want to just put this in the blender because it would break the blender. So while this is soft, once the polypore is soft, you can cut it into small pieces and either dry those out for preservation or later use, or you can soak the materials for a little while until they're nice and squishy or pliable. So these are ready to go right into the blender. Now I've already started with a batch of stock that's going to go into my slurry. This slurry is pretty thick. I've already loaded a few blenderfuls into my tub, but we're going to add a little bit more stock here because we want it to be nice thick paper. The amount of stock that you put into your slurry is directly related to how thick the paper will be. So the more stock that you have in the slurry, the thicker the paper. The more you pull out of the slurry, the thinner the paper will become. So we're gonna give this a blend. So when you add your mushrooms into the blender, your soft, pliable, soaked mushrooms into the blender, you're gonna need to add water in order to get enough looseness in the blender. So once that's nice and ground up, we're gonna add this into the stock. But the first thing that I'll do, and I'll probably go through this process 3 or 4 times, is run it through a cheesecloth. And that's gonna help me to catch all of the really big chunks that maybe the blender hasn't quite processed yet. So you have to do a little bit of like finger acrobatics to make a little pouch. And we're gonna try to pour the spout of the blender in through the cheesecloth. Then I'll just give this a nice squeeze. And if some of the slurry sneaks through, that's okay. But what this is getting is all of the really, really tiny fibers that'll help to make a kind of a nicer, a finer paper. My preference is for nice, really thick, juicy paper with lots of texture. So I actually prefer a lot of pulp in my papers. So once I've squeezed out that water, I'm gonna add this back into the blender and run through this process 3 or 4 times before I'm ready to pull my paper. And once I make sure that I have enough stock or enough slurry for pulling the paper. Once I've got that nice burning smell from the motor of the blender, I'm gonna stop using the blender. Luckily, it's ready to add into the bath. So I've gone through the cheesecloth several times. I know that I've pretty much gotten all of the big chunks ground down, and I'll just pour this straight into the slurry and set that aside. And now we're ready to pull some paper. When you're ready to pull your paper, on the mold and decal, you're gonna make sure that you wanna have a stack of rags that are dry and pretty clean. And then also your non-porous surface, and then obviously your slurry. So the slurry should be pretty thick, and I'm gonna give it a nice stir So once that slurry is nice and stirred up, all those fibers are suspended, you're gonna grab the mold and decal really tightly, making sure those are pressed very firmly against each other, and then you're just gonna dunk it in, making sure you get it underneath, and then bringing it out very level. I'm gonna give it a little jiggle. We wanna just make sure those fibers are dispersed very evenly on the screen. So giving it a little jiggle, we're gonna let all that water drip out. Just give my decal a little, clean it off here. You can pull the decal off, set it aside, and you'll see how that's formed the edges of the paper. And you can also see that that paper is nice and thick. And we're ready to move on to the couching process. The couching process is when we transfer the paper onto the towel. And this requires a little finesse. And this process involves kind of pressing in one edge of the mold and then keeping a firm pressure and then gradually and lifting it up on the other side. So again, that's kind of pressing in one end and then maintaining that pressure, and then in a kind of a wave-like motion, you're gonna lift it up. So it's sort of this motion. So I'll grab hold of the back sides of the mold, and I'm gonna apply pressure to one side. And then as I've transferred it, I'm gonna just gradually lift up on the other side. You can see how it just nicely falls off of that mold. If you have troubles in this process, don't worry, because you can always scrape off the pulp from the mold and dump it back into your slurry and do this process as many times as you want. Just making sure that you always have a dry rag to couche it onto. So from here, we need to transfer it to the glass. So I'm just gonna kind of pick it up and move it over. And this can kind of get the paper to be a little bit of funky shape actually. So you might wanna just sort of be a little careful about not distorting the size of the paper shape too much. And then just gonna flip it over and lay it down. And then give it a little pressure on one end, and then we can just roll it up. It might need a little bit of help to get it to stick to the glass. Once we get that edge started, it'll roll up really nice. So that edge is started, and then I just kind of give a little bit of pressure and then roll that rag back. And there we go. And now I can just let it dry there. And with the magic of television, I have one already dried. And once you've let it dry, and you can let it dry in the sun or just in a room, but you wanna make sure that there's enough airflow to the space so that it doesn't get moldy. So if you're in a part of the country where it's really hot and humid, sometimes it's pretty moldy, but out here in Colorado, I can just let this out in the sun for a couple hours and it dries pretty nicely. If you have trouble getting it off the glass, you can use a nice paint scraper to kind of help it along. You just want to be careful that you don't tear the edges of your paper as you go. So I'm just gonna give this a little bit of help, gradually lift it off of the surface, and I want to be careful not to tear it along the way. If it gets really dry, sometimes it'll just lift off of itself. You can also iron these. If you place like some newspaper or a towel, you can iron the surface to help that drying process and make sure it keeps really flat. And there you go. We have a nice piece of paper. When you're ready to clean up, One thing that's very important to remember is to not wash these things in your household drains. And definitely never dump your slurry down the drain. What you can do to preserve this is to run it through a sieve to collect as much as you can and then dry that out for later use. Because it's already blended, pretty much all you would need to do is rehydrate it and then add it right back into your slurry. I recommend getting a secondary tub or buckets to wash out all of your materials, and then dumping that water into your compost or outside somewhere. But don't put it down your drain. I hope you've enjoyed learning how to make paper with mushrooms, but I want to encourage you to not just stop there. There's so many cool things that you can do with handmade paper. So experimenting with color and the kinds of mushrooms that you use is wonderful, and I encourage everybody to try things. You can also try different materials, not just mushrooms. You can even make paper from a can of tomato soup. You can also add things into your paper. In this piece, I've added lichen to get different colors within the texture. So it not only adds texture, but it also adds little speckles of black into that surface. I've also added gesso and watercolor to paint onto the surface of this drawing. You can cast the paper onto any material that you like. So this is cast directly onto a piece of recycled polystyrene, and then that wet pulp will just sort of stick to anything. In this piece, I put the paper directly onto, or the pulp directly onto bubble wrap to get this really cool honeycomb texture. And in this artwork, you can see how I've bent it around the piece of the styrofoam and made different shapes of it. And I'm also painting directly onto it. In this piece, rather than making paper, I just used the pulp itself like paper mache. And I added it to just this regular piece of styrofoam that was left over from packaging. So you can kind of see how it's thick and different. And then you can see some of my other artworks here that I've added mushroom pulp directly onto pieces of styrofoam. So I encourage everybody to experiment and have fun, and I hope you enjoyed this demonstration about how to make handmade paper with mushrooms. Thanks for watching, and if you have questions, you can email me, but please check out my website at jesslangley.com.